Jack Davies. I hope I pronounced it correctly. He's from the United Kingdom. He is a research and development scientist in N-Chain with a focus on blockchain solutions for companies. He's an expert in research and communication and technical drafting with a history in writing these research documents. He has a master's in natural sciences and physics, and also in material sciences in the University of Cambridge. It is a true honor to have him here because he is a very active person. He has his own meetup in Wales, and I follow him from a distance. I follow what he does, so we really are very interested in spreading his work and having everybody know about what he does. So it is an honor to have him here. And I really have to thank the people in Argentina who are also doing the simultaneous interpretation, and they're doing very good job. So thank you to them as well. Jack, you have the floor. Go ahead.
Hi, thanks very much for that lovely introduction, and a pleasure to be here. So I'm really looking forward to giving you this talk. I'm just going to share my screen quickly, and I hope everyone can hear me. Please let me know if you need to turn the volume up or anything. So I think you should be able to see my screen now. Just shout if you can't, but I'll assume otherwise that you can. Okay, so I'm going to give you a talk today about another quite burgeoning field related quite closely to blockchain, but actually is not necessarily a blockchain topic. It's a new kind of area of cryptography that's only around 20 years old or so. And so this is it's about physically unclonable functions, which are a class of a new kind of device category of devices that can be applied in quite a lot of ways to cryptography, and we're going to see a lot about the application. So I'm going to try and give you an overview of the entire field, and just to give you a quick idea of what I'm going to discuss. So I'll start with just trying to motivate what these physically unclonable functions, and we'll refer to them as puffs throughout, because this is how the acronym we use for them generally. So I'm going to try and motivate exactly what they are and why they're important and how they work. And they're actually quite analogous to an existing cryptographic primitive of the hash function. So I'm going to try and use that analogy to help you understand this. Then we're going to talk about some of the different categories of puffs themselves. So there's broadly two classes, weak and strong puffs, and then there's another stricter type of strong puff called a control puff. So I'm going to give you an overview of what these are, some examples of them, and what they're actually useful for independently. And then I'm going to finally focus on a few of the different properties and finish up with some more real world applications. So give you a flavor of where this kind of area of research is going. And bear in mind, it is a very new area of research, and we're seeing the scope of applications grow quite quickly. Okay, so firstly, the overview of physically unclonable functions. So this is really the whistle-stop tour to help you understand exactly what we mean when we use this term throughout the rest of the talk. So we can use the definition given by a researcher called Gassend and his collaborators in the 2002 paper, which really is you can see that only 18 years ago, but this is really when the field is kind of being defined from. There are a few papers that preceded this, but the actual formal definitions kind of come from this paper. So they define a physically unclonable function as a random function that is evaluated with the help of a specific physical system. So where we normally think of random functions as something you might implement in code, actually this here is something where we're specifically leveraging the properties of a physical system or object to generate the randomness. And if anyone's familiar with the concepts around randomness, this actually might make a lot of sense, because when we talk about trying to generate sources of true randomness or pseudo randomness, when we try and generate a true source of randomness, we end up having to default to measuring natural phenomena. So things like measuring noise in electrical circuits or flipping a coin a large number of times. So it kind of makes sense that we would start looking at mapping entire functions of generating randomness to physical systems instead of these kind of single use concepts. So I mentioned that there's a strong analogy here between puffs and what I'll call a physical hash function. So I'll assume most people are familiar with the hash function, but in case we're not, I can still just give it a quick understanding. And I'm going to use a lot of boxes throughout this talk to represent a system where we may or may not know the internal workings of it. So often in cryptography and computer science, we'll talk about a black box being something that takes an input, produces an output, and whether or not we know the internal workings is kind of the extra question we have to ask. But hash functions, so SHA-256 is a very well-known example of a cryptographic hash function, and one that's used extensively in Bitcoin. It's the one that's used involved with the mining process. And really, you can model SHA-256 as a black box, where we take a message, so kind of any arbitrary size data input, and we get a fixed length message digest out. So I could put in a text file called myfile.txt, and then I get a fixed length string output by the hash function. The key thing to note here is that with a cryptographic hash function like SHA-256, we have a very good understanding of the inner workings of this box. So SHA-256 and other cryptographic hash functions are defined. Their specifications are available to read online. You can write down actually the entire circuit if you wanted to for these functions. So it's hard to predict what the output is going to be before we've performed one of these hash functions, and there are lots of properties associated with them, like non-invertibility and collision resistance. But crucially, we get this property even while knowing exactly how SHA-256 works. It's just every time we present it with a new input, we're expecting to get a new output. And when we call this hash function deterministic, so its output really does look a bit like a pseudo-random number based on or pseudo-random string based on the message you give it. But we know exactly how it's converting it to that. So then we come to a puff, and if we're going to model one of these physical systems, which we claim acts like a random function, then what does this look like? Well, without looking inside the box to start with, this is the behavior. So this is the expected behavior of one of these functions. So instead of having our message in a message digest in a hash function, the analogy is we'll have a challenge and we'll get a response out of the puff. So here, the challenge can come in many forms, and that's why I haven't written it numerically on the left. And we'll talk about that later in terms of different types of puffs. But you could, for simplicity, think of your challenge as a random string that you've chosen, and then you'll get a random response out that looks again like a random number with respect to the challenge. So given the response, I wouldn't necessarily know or be able to predict or work out what the challenge was. And the same with a hash function. Given the message digest, I couldn't reverse engineer what the message was that I put into it. The key difference in this analogy, though, is that with our puff, we really don't have any visibility of the internal workings of the system. So this is very much like a hash function, except we don't know exactly how it's getting to those responses from the challenges we provide it. And this is actually a key assumption that underlies the security of using puffs in kind of cryptography. So what is actually going on? Well, let's assume we could look in there. This physical system will be parameterized by lots of different variables and lots of different things. So I've tried to represent that by saying we have this physical system. Think of it like an object with different parameters that describe that object. So in theory, there may be a way to perfectly describe everything about this object, but we're assuming that it's actually incredibly hard to fully characterize that object. So if I have that object in my hand, if I have this puff device in my hand, it will be incredibly or feasibly difficult for me to tell you the exact pattern of shapes and the colors of those shapes within the puff. So again, just for explanatory purposes, but it would be incredibly hard for me to tell you the internal makeup of the object, even if I have the object. So to an observer, this still really does look like a black box where I don't know the internal workings, unlike our hash function. And really, you can see I've tried to represent the influence of the internal system on the challenge is what generates the response. So not only is it impossible for us to work out exactly how it's influencing, but crucially, the response is dependent on the internal system, and it's deterministic. So if I provide the same challenge to this system in exactly the same way, I'd expect it to interact with the internal state of the system in exactly the same way and produce the same response. So you can think of what's happening inside the box as a fairly randomized interaction between our challenge and the system. It gives us a response that therefore looks quite random as well. So let's look at our different scenarios for if we're presenting different challenges and getting different responses. So here we have a puff A, the same one I just showed you. Now, if I present this with one challenge, I'm expecting to get one response. If I then subject the exact same puff to a second challenge, then actually I expect to get a completely different response. So if the two challenges I subject it to or probe it with are not equal, then my response is also not equal. So again, this continues that analogy with the hash function. If I have two messages and I hash them with SHA-256, I will get two completely unrelated message digests, and there'll be no way to change them. And similarly, changing my challenges by a small amount should result in a response that is drastically different. So there should be no way to change the challenges to see a relationship between the responses. So again, it's very, very similar to the properties we associate with cryptographic hash functions. So now what happens if we take a different physically inclinable function? So here I have two different puff devices, puff A and puff B, and you can see they have different internal makeups. They have different parameters that characterize the internal state of that system. So if I give the same challenge that I gave earlier to puff A, again, I get the same response we've seen already. And if I give that same challenge to the other puff, we'd expect a completely different response. So again, this is analogous to puff A and puff B looking like two completely different hash functions. Again, we don't know how they are different. We don't know how they work internally differently. But you can think of every single instance of a puff device as its own kind of unique cryptographic hash function, which is very interesting, I think. So if I have the same challenge, I will get different responses, and this should hold. Even if the devices themselves are very, very similar and are produced by the same manufacturer, we expect them to still have enough random variation to achieve this result. And this is one of the key kind of assumptions, is that the variations that cause these different responses are on such a small scale. So I think in general it's the micron scale or smaller are the variations that are causing these differences in response. So we assume that even a manufacturer couldn't be influencing or designing a device to give a particular response, and it can't be controlled. So we call this concept manufacturer resistance. So even a manufacturer that's mass producing, say, a silicon chip that has these random process variations, they won't have any influence on the nature of those variations in the outcome devices. So to summarize our kind of quick tour, these puffs are really just physical systems with these random variations that are manufacturer resistant, and they act like these black box devices that are very similar in a sense to hash functions, except every single device can be considered like its own hash function. The difference being, again, we call the inputs challenges and the outputs responses that we give it. And a really important point is that the internal state of the system is kind of acting like, you might have been wondering this already, it's acting a bit like a private key or a digital key. except unlike a normal digital key, it's not actually being stored in memory. It's actually the entire state of the system. So it's very hard to, or effectively impossible to perform an invasive attack on the PUF device to extract a key, where you could extract a key that's written to disk or sometimes stored in memory and things like this. And it's important to remember that those two properties, if you take nothing else away, that these PUFs are deterministic, and each one is unique as well. So for each device we have, we can actually enumerate many of these challenge response pairs. This is the terminology we use. Every time we subject a particular PUF to a challenge, we'll yield a response, and then we can create this mapping of challenges I've chosen to the responses the PUF gives me for each device. And again, we expect this to be very different for every PUF device we use. Even if we use exactly the same challenges, we expect them to map to different outputs. And these challenge response pairs and the maps we can have between them form the basis of lots of their applications. So we'll talk a bit later about how these things can be used as key cards. Well, here you can see these actually look a bit like one-time pads, where I could consume a single challenge to yield a particular response. And if I have an authentication protocol with, say, a digital lock that knows a lot of my challenge response pairs, I can then present, it can present me with a challenge later, and I can present the correct response. And that's a way of authenticating my device with the lock or the other system. So as I mentioned, there are actually really two broad classes of PUFs, and we call them weak and strong PUFs. I'm going to go into some detail in a moment about what we actually mean by this and what the key distinction is. And even further, these strong PUFs are kind of subcategorized into control PUFs as well. And there is some overlap here because, again, it's a very new field and the terminology is almost ever evolving as well. Sometimes there seems to be a gray area between a particular PUF device and how you'd categorize it. But we'll explain in a moment why that gray area exists, because it tends to involve how the system scales in a number of challenges and responses you can have. So the first one to talk about is our weak PUFs. And weak PUFs are probably the most commonly used type of PUF actually in existence right now. And the key characterization of them is that they have a very small challenge response pair space. So effectively, they don't have many challenge response pairs to use. It's analogous to them really storing a single key in that physical system. So as you can see on the left here, this is an example of what's called an SRAM PUF, which is by far the most popular, the most widely used example of both the weak PUF and PUFs in general. And you can see that on the top left here, we have these sub-micron process variations in the creation of these chips. Then based on their internal state, when they're delivered a voltage, they have what are called bistable states. So when powered on, there are lots of these smaller circuits that will either be in one state, which is 0, or another state, which is the 1. And based on a combination of these smaller circuits, you can actually build up this silicon fingerprint you see here in step 3. So based on lots of these 0s and 1s, we actually build up a fingerprint large enough for it to be a kind of high entropy digital key. And this is kind of the point about weak PUFs, is all that information on the SRAM device is enough to give you information about one key, because it scales linearly with the number of these smaller circuits. So how we tend to classify them is in terms of how does the CRP space scale in terms of the number of or the size, the entire size of the device or the PUF. And again, it's hard to talk in general terms because there's so many different examples, but this is a really good one just to be as a basis for understanding. And crucially, because we have a small space, but then we need to make sure that access to these are restricted, because if someone can enumerate all these challenge response pairs, then they'll be able to effectively impersonate that device. So we can use this as a kind of a root digital key for our applications, but we need to make sure that we only ever expose that device or that key internally, and that we can use that security to that key to underpin the security of another system. So again, in the analogy of something like a master key for an HD wallet, that underpins the security of the whole wallet of many keys. Here we would never want to expose the single key that we're storing in the weak path, but we might use lots of derived keys from that. And crucially, these are in generally very cheap and practical to produce and use, hence their popularity. So this SRAM puff example is exactly that. It's used very, very widely, and you can, I won't go into all the detail here, but you can see most popularly, if you see right at the bottom of this kind of diagram, we go through some internal processing, some fuzzy matching and error correction, but ultimately you're producing a single key from these entropy sources on the SRAM device. And once you get that key, you're putting it through, you can put it through any standard crypto function you need. So if you're using that for encryption, digital signature generation, threshold signatures like Mika was talking about earlier, signing things for certificates and PKI, these are kind of where you'd use this as a base key for an application like that. And as I say, use cases, so the use cases of these are relatively limited, but still quite powerful, I think. So as I said before, this is actually a really nice way to effectively be able to store and secure a digital key, but not having to write that to memory, or only keeping it transiently in memory and never writing it in disk. So it's much less vulnerable to physical attacks that you would normally associate with storing keys on other devices. So you can think of your physical system really as its own key, and if someone were to try and probe and open that system up, crucially they would alter the system. So we said that the responses depend on the internal state of the system. If someone was to try and invasively attack the system to extract some information about it, you'd find that they'd actually alter that system and change the response. So they might be able to break into the device, but in doing so, they'd actually kind of nullify any advantage or benefit they could get from extracting information. So it's kind of almost like a self-destruct for that key that's kind of built in. And this lends itself very well to device identification. So you can think of many areas where being able to tie identity to a device is useful. We'll come on to one particular application in kind of supply chains for this later, because if you think of, say, the diamonds or expensive watch supply chains, where you have these high value items, we care a lot about whether or not they've been counterfeited and whether the actual item is genuine. So one of the first steps in trying to solve that problem is generally trying to link some digital identity to it so that we can authenticate when we're actually talking to or interacting with that device. So that's one example. Another is another example of device identification is in software licensing. So making sure that software will only run on a particular machine, or that code can only be run by a particular machine. And this is something that's very popular in licensing FPGA circuits. So people can design these FPGAs, but make sure they're licensed by only working on particular devices. And this is a really effective way, because there you're using the fact that your device is intrinsically linked with one key to make sure. And again, there's some complexity about how it works, but it's very powerful to be able to know and authenticate which device you're interacting with at any point. And I think we can think of lots of other use cases for that. But again, we're kind of limited to a single, a small number of keys we can use with a weak puff. So that's why we come on to the second category called the strong puffs, or more recently the control puffs. So what do we mean by this other category of physically inclinable functions? Well, these are, again, where we characterized weak puffs with a small space. we can characterize strong puffs by having a much larger CRP space. And actually, to be more precise, we're actually saying that the number of challenge response pairs we can have for a strong puff, it scales exponentially in the size. So the number of kind of the number of smaller components within that system. You can see again on the left here we have what's called the arbiter puff, which is one of the famous examples of a strong puff. And here you have delays between gates that are effectively generating a random result in the arbiter unit at the end. Well, we can actually have a large challenge response pace that is exponential in the number of these smaller gates we have. And the key here again is that it should be infeasible to enumerate all those challenge response pairs. So even if an attacker was given the device, it should be very difficult for me to for the attacker to produce all those challenge response pairs. And this again is similar to with a hash function. That's partly why we don't worry about everyone understanding how SHA-256 works, is because the space of the outputs of SHA-256 is so large. You have 2 to the 256 possible outputs effectively. It would take far too long for an attacker to try every single input and get every output of the hash function. Similarly here, we're saying our strong puff is acting like a cryptographic hash function with a very large space. So when a weak puff, we weren't able to release any challenge response pairs directly. This actually allows them to have what's called an unprotected interface. So I could actually allow my attacker to have physical access to my device, and it actually doesn't change that. And we'll see that that's actually really key for its applications being much more focused in use of key cards and things. So again, the two examples we have here, at the top of the page is called an optical puff. And I think this is very easy to understand. It's very similar to the ones I showed you right at the start, the abstract model. Our optical puff is really, what you see here is called an optical token, which is a medium that's filled with small aerations or bubbles. And when you shine a light or shine a laser on that at a particular orientation, at a particular angle of incidence, theta, you'll get a different speckle pattern resulting from its interaction with all these bubbles in the medium. And for every angle you can probe that at, you'll get a different response. So that's how we get our CRP mapping for the optical puff. And then, as I mentioned, the arbiter puff at the bottom is to do with passing signals through wires, and based on the delay, the path dependence of the electrical signals that we send through there, will generate a random result in the arbiter at the end. So again, these are just two very good examples. You can also see that something like the optical puff is actually quite unwieldy and hard to implement practically. The arbiter puff is much improved on that, but still is much more of a challenge than something like a weak puff to implement. And then finally, as a subclass of the strong puff, we also have the control puffs or C puffs. And crucially, these just restrict the challenge response space of a strong puff using some control logic. So here you can see the puff actually is surrounding the control logic, and that's because in this definition from that same paper I mentioned earlier, the control logic is connected with the puff or used with the puff in an inseparable way. So here, our puff there's actually a kind of symbiotic protection going on. So the control logic exists to protect the puff from protocol attacks. So some attacks that were discovered to do with the initial strong puffs, the control logic helps to solve those. But enclosing that in the puff medium itself or within a puff device actually means that the puff is protecting the control logic from an invasive attack, so someone trying to modify the control logic. And again, this is using the same concept whereby if I try to perform an invasive attack on a puff, I end up changing the medium and then changing the responses it would give. So the attacker actually has no incentive to invade the puff itself. So again, this is a subclass of the strong puffs we just mentioned, where now we are protecting that CR interface, our challenge response interface, And crucially, this control logic is intertwined with the actual puff medium itself. But again, these are still impractical with respect to weak puffs. So there's kind of a middle ground that's missing between our controlled strong puffs and our weak puffs. To give you one example, and again, this is just for illustrative purposes, but this is a puff that has an FSM or finite state machine that implements the control logic. So you can see here, the output is the key on the right-hand side that comes from the hash function combining some objects. But the only way you can invoke this hash function is if the finite state machine outputs the correct value based on the response output by the puff. So this is basically adding in a kind of two-way protection on how you access the puff and how you can use it in the entire device itself. But again, it's not something that I would say to worry about all the internal workings, and there are lots of different versions, but the key is that we are now protecting the challenge response interface. And use cases for strong puffs. So this is much more around authentication of, or more complex authentication. So not just having a single unique identifier for a device, but actually being able to authenticate something many, many times. So key cards being the kind of original application for strong puffs. So again, I say you can consume one of these CR pairs as a kind of one-time authentication, and then you can have many, many authentications using the same device and only having to refresh periodically. So I've tried to represent here on the right-hand side that these actually, they can do kind of everything you'd need. So you can do key generation, of course, and you can actually have many more keys generated using our strong puffs. We can also use that for identity, but crucially, this allows much more complex and much more powerful authentication protocols. So that tends to be where they're used more frequently. And of course, identity, which we'll come on to in a minute, is kind of the crux of all these things. So whether it's human or machine identity we want to secure, that's the end goal. So finally, just to wrap up, I want to go into a slightly more detail on these applications. So in particular, how they can be applied in Bitcoin and maybe other areas. So as I alluded to many times already, identity is really the name of the game with puffs. And whether it's trying to authenticate humans for KYC purposes and making sure that we can have that implemented in kind of Bitcoin payments or any payment really. The key there being that when you communicate using a puff, or when you use a puff, you're communicating using these challenges and responses. And that means it's actually a very lightweight protocol. So identity protocols that use puffs, although there's a physical element to them, that was almost having a kind of upfront burden of having to have this device, but then actually reduces the burden of communications and complexity when you actually authenticate something later. So it's actually a very lightweight method of authenticating things. And again, the puff is always being used to bind an identity to that physical system that we just discussed earlier. Again, we've gone through this already, but just to reiterate, weak puffs and strong puffs do have kind of quite different applications in identity. So we mentioned software licensing, and having a single key tied to a device identity is the main kind of thing for weak puffs. But this is again where you'd see in the blockchain space, we're seeing lots and lots of projects start to look at using weak puffs for kind of supply chain tracking solutions, especially in those kind of industries for high value or counterfeited goods I mentioned. But again, software licensing is one of the classical examples of that too. And then strong puffs for our key cards, and also establishing chains of trust between different people and again, it could be a supply chain, but this is a way of doing it in a particular supply chain with the original manufacturer. So we said the manufacturer can't actually influence the nature of the puffs themselves, but we can still establish a chain of trust with them that uses the puffs themselves later. And finally, I mentioned again, key generation, although relatively boring for some, is actually very useful to us in Bitcoin, because there's lots of different things that you can do with it. So obviously this lets you generate our private keys and sign Bitcoin transactions, which is very useful. And again, we have that benefit of not actually storing that physical key. So if you need a way to securely keep your private key that isn't vulnerable to an invasive attack, then this is actually quite a good method. And again, you can think about how you might distribute shares amongst many of such devices. But again, we can also do things like encrypting on-chain data, because we can use, as you see on the left here, we can use this for any crypto primitive. So if we want to use AES, for example, we can encrypt data and put that on the blockchain that is encrypted and decrypted only by access to the puff. So that's very useful. And things like access tokens. So access tokens we mentioned in the context of key cards, but they're obviously much more useful when you can have payments in a kind of blockchain world, where you can then combine maybe access to data as well as goods and services. And those access tokens could just be something like a hash chain that uses our puffs as well. So there's lots of different ways that being a key generator is very, very useful application of puffs. Okay, I think I've managed to fill a fair bit of time there. So I think it's a good time to stop and see if there are any questions. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope it was interesting.
Una pregunta, yo creo que hay un millón de preguntas.
I have a question. I think there are like a million questions on the chat, but honestly, I think I speak on behalf of everyone when I say that this was extremely interesting, and maybe these questions are a bit repetitive because it's something you just said. So I apologize beforehand if I'm asking things that you already said, but maybe it just helps people, clarify or sort of really assimilate the concepts and understand what you were explaining. So, for example, they just asked if they have to be able to, does it make sense to build two identical puffs or PUFs?
Yeah, so and just don't worry about the questions being repetitive or anything, because that was a very whistle-stop tour of a rapidly evolving field. So part of the challenge is every single paper that comes out has slight differences in terminology and constructions anyway. So trying to generalize to something like this is actually quite difficult. But yeah, I'm sure all the questions are valid. So on that question, the assumption is that it's you in any particular, because you can pick an example of a puff, right? So puff works as a conceptual thing, but then there are specific implementations of puffs. So I mentioned SRAM puff is the kind of canonical example of a weak puff, but then you also have the arbiter puff as a very popular example of a strong puff. And there are, honestly, there's like, you can find a taxonomy of hundreds of different examples. Some of them use things like magnetic coils and things like this. So what you can do is, if you pick any of those implementations of a puff, then you can say, what are the attack vectors? And in general, all puff implementations are done under the assumption that it would be impossible to design a puff to behave in a particular way. So generally, that assumption comes back down to you're manufacturing or creating a particular physical device to implement this. And we are looking for a system where the variations are so small that it would be impossible for the manufacturer, or very impractical, both economically and literally and physically, to try and design it to behave in a certain way. And that's the starting assumption for all these implementations. And then once someone picks an implementation, they'll say it's kind of like I think of it as the hard problem behind each cryptographic scheme or crypto system. So you can find something like decisional Diffie-Hellman and then build your crypto system on that discrete log problem, and then you build the system. Well, similarly, you'll look for a physical system where there's something that's very difficult to characterize, and then you'll say, how can we build a puff out of that property? So again, in a good puff implementation, that is the base assumption that people wouldn't be able to just manipulate the a particular puff to behave in a certain way because of the scale of the variations and the difficulty of changing those variations. I hope that answered the question. It's quite a difficult one, but
Sí, gracias por responderla.
Thank you for answering that question. And I think the same person asked another question, but is a bit combined with something that I wanted to ask. And so here it goes. This idea of the variables, which in a way determine the context of use and functionality in terms of what the puff identifies or tracks. So what happens if those variables are modified? What happens if the device, which is linked to that puff, breaks? Or if there's a modification that needs to be done?
Yeah, that's a good question. So yeah, the first thing to say is that yes, if your puff is damaged, and again, how you protect it from damage is another question. But if it is altered, then generally the response will be different. That characteristic I mentioned, and it will no longer function. So if it does get attacked or broken, then it won't produce the same. So it will no longer be effective at storing, for example, a digital key. So a lot of the challenge, I think, is around once you've chosen to implement something with a puff, then you have to decide. You have to build in lots of things around that. So authentication protocols, I mentioned, you might enumerate lots of challenge response pairs to use as one-time access tokens. So the schedule you use for refreshing the device, for regenerating a new set, that's an important consideration to make sure that you are regularly communicating, and it's always going to be a trade-off. So I said the fact that it's very lightweight and that you can communicate. If you want to authenticate me at authentication time, you can just send me a challenge that we used previously, and I can give you the response. And those are very lightweight things that we may be able to communicate even in plain text in some protocols. So the challenge is designing the protocols around the puffs to use that correctly. And that's part of what happened actually with the controlled puffs. That was motivated by weaknesses found in the early versions of strong puffs. So it was found that there were particular attacks where you could interact with a strong puff and it would give away information about the responses that help you model the internal system. And that's one of the main attacks on strong puffs actually is using AI modeling of the system to then try and simulate the physical system using software. That's one of the main challenges. So control puffs is an example of basically someone who built or proposed additional protocols on top of it. But again, it's hard to answer in specifics. That's probably the most specific case I can point to is control puffs adding this control logic in a very specific way to solve a problem around information leakage. So then whenever you're going to use it, you should build in things. So for example, your Bitcoin private keys, even if you wanted to just split a key using Shamir secret sharing into 2 or 3 parts and then store, use a puff to help store them. As I say, you can use the cryptographic primitives using puff keys in any way you want. So if you want to encrypt some data on a disk using that key, that's also a valid use case. So again, it always comes down to what you're trying to achieve. But yes, there's lots of things to think about at kind of the layer above the actual physical device as well.
De verdad que estoy muy tentada a saltearme todas las otras preguntas y seguir preguntando.
I would keep asking you questions and not ask any from the audience, but I'm not going to do that. Someone is asking me if the use of puff could reduce the
theft.
The theft. Could help reduce theft. And if you don't mind, maybe clarify for the audience what theft is.
Yeah. So what theft is generally, I guess. So what the main protection you get from um, puffs is comes back to that not storing a physical key, and storing a physical key has lots and lots of associated attacks. Um, if you whenever you have to write something to disk, you open it up to risks where there are ways of extracting keys, without even getting inside the device, and some kind of famous examples of that. So if and again, theft of your bitcoins is a legal thing anyway. So just losing your keys doesn't mean you've lost your Bitcoin, but if theft is losing practical control of your Bitcoin, then that's a risk you always have if you're trying to manually store your own private keys. So all those different wallet types that Mika mentioned earlier, anywhere in those systems, even to a degree in cold storage, I'd say, where you are writing down a key to disk, this is kind of a way of removing some of those attacks. Now, you also want to take care, because, as I say, if that device gets destroyed, then it's you no longer have you've essentially lost the practical control yourself. So it's like, I've stolen it from myself, which isn't great. So you need to take steps like redundancy, and having a system where you might have multiple different pieces of hardware involved. But that's the main thing, I think, which is storing keys on disk has been the source of quite a lot of different hacks in the past, especially when that information is related to very highly valuable bitcoins.
Genial, me están preguntando. En cuanto al uso de...
Another question, in terms of using puffs to authenticate products in the supply chain, how popular is this in practice, and whether we are seeing implementations at a larger scale or not yet, or if you had to draw a conclusion in terms of the cost-benefit analysis for this?
So in terms of how recently, I would say it's rapidly becoming a focus. So people who've been looking at enterprise blockchain solutions for these industries, like counterfeiting, watches, and diamonds, or really anything where you have to track something through a supply chain, but it's much more important, I think, to the stakeholders in those types of industries. That's somewhere where people have gone from basic solutions and going from things like QR codes to RFID, and this is the natural evolution on trying to solve this problem has now reached, I think, quite widely has now reached using puffs. So I would say only as recently as the last year have I really seen puffs and in the context of blockchain being used, but I've seen it a lot very, very quickly. It's become almost like another buzzword. But I think it's being looked at quite as a serious solution to a problem here. And in terms of a cost-benefit analysis, again, it's always going to be case by case. But I think if you go back to particularly high-value items, you can see there where the integrity of the item itself is important, and therefore also you assume if the device is still intact and in good condition, then the puff element, whether or not it's in the device or attached to it in some way, will also be intact. So having something that if my goods are the same and haven't been damaged, then I should have a way to authenticate with it that hasn't been damaged. Then I think it's quite powerful, and we're just starting to look at the implications of it. But yeah, it's definitely not a magic bullet like anything, in the sense that it's very important to have the rest of the structure. So it's not like, I don't think you can attach puffs to the system and everything is better necessarily, but I think it can help in the overall solution. I think we talked a lot about supply chain and device ID, but even things like KYC and being able to do things like offline payments and KYC for offline payments more easily. I think that's quite powerful as well.
Tengo una pregunta más, la verdad que disculpame.
I have one more question. I'm sorry if we're bombarding you with questions. But I think that this has triggered a lot of interest from the people in terms of possibilities of implementation. When you were talking about strong puffs, what I interpreted, and I'm speaking individually, what I understood is that basically the level of security was very similar to this situation where you had to implement a lot of computing power in terms of processing, and also the security system had to do with the expenditure of that processing system. Is this a correct assumption, or, I mean, I don't know if I'm interpreting correctly.
Yeah, that is I think correct. The attacks, so when you have a strong puff and you relax this assumption, when you say I'm allowing people to see my challenge response pairs in plain text, so remember with a weak puff we want to keep them private, which is a constraint, but you know there are clearly lots of applications that you can still use within that constraint. And then a strong puff, again, one of the major touted benefits of them is supposedly that you can have the CRP pairs out in the plane and it doesn't matter if someone can look at them a lot. But again, if you had someone with a large amount of computing power, then maybe they could enumerate lots of the CRPs. I'm not saying it's necessarily a practical attack, but the sophistication of the attacks, like I mentioned, the machine learning modeling attacks, that is probably one of the main security risks with those particular types of puffs, in the sense that there may be, and again, because it's implementation to implementation, there may be two different strong puff examples where one might end up being much more easily modeled than another, and then you might not know until further down the line. So again, I hate to be kind of almost copying out of that, but it depends on which puff you're talking about as well. But equally, you can take other steps, even if you're using a strong puff to, you know, even though you can have them in plain text, I think, you know, you can take the steps of using secure communication channels as well, where you need them. So again, lots of it is up to the implementer, I think, and depending on what exact use case you have.
Perfecto, bueno, genial.
Perfect. I think that I've read all the questions. I've sort of combined many of the questions, and I've asked my questions as well. So I really thank you for your presentation, and thank you for taking the time for answering all the questions. I don't know if there are any other questions, or Ramon? No. Just basically, for someone who is not technical, listening to this type of talk is really amazing. From an outsider's perspective, what we are seeing now is a lot of implementation also for the IoT, the Internet of Things, and the communication between machines, and protecting those machines that will be communicating one with the other, and probably paying for that communication and that interaction.
Yeah, I think that's a good example of where that's going to be useful is IoT, and that's where the cost benefit of, you know, which type you use comes into it, because you need something that's light and practical and cheap enough to use on maybe large networks of small devices that need to be uniquely identified. But that's a really good example that I forgot to mention. I'm glad you mentioned that. Thanks.
Me sonaba, ¿no? Todo el concepto veía que la comunicación.
Yeah, I thought of it because the communication between machines, or let's say the security of that machine communication, that was something very strong, very powerful. And actually, you are telling us that now, even to break that security just by force, you would need a lot more calculation power than by using a different kind of security system. So I do believe it's very interesting. I think it's actually very interesting to start implementing this gradually in blockchain technology, and that we are visualizing all of this already, facing the future, we need to get ready for the future. So thank you indeed for your presentation.
A pleasure. Thanks very much.